The most dangerous lie is the one told under oath, because everyone expects the truth to be standing beside it. Those words drifted through courtroom 7 long before the judge entered, whispered by an elderly reporter who had spent 4 decades covering trials that changed careers, families, and sometimes entire cities. No one in the gallery knew that within the next hour, a single video would become more powerful than every sworn statement spoken that morning. The courtroom was already full. Journalists lined the back row with notebooks resting on their knees. Law students leaned forward, eager to witness what seemed like another routine hearing involving an officer's testimony. Uniformed deputies stood along the walls with practiced expressions that revealed nothing. Sunlight poured through the tall courthouse windows, washing the polished wooden floor in warm light that made the room feel almost peaceful. Yet beneath that calm surface, tension quietly waited. At the defense table sat Denise Carter, a composed black woman in a navy blue suit. Her posture never changed. Her hands rested gently on a folder that had remained closed since the hearing began. She did not whisper to her attorney. She did not glance toward the spectators searching for sympathy. Instead, she looked only toward the witness stand, where Officer Daniel Hawkins adjusted his uniform before raising his right hand to swear the oath. Hawkins carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed the courtroom belonged to him. His badge reflected the morning light as though it were another medal earned through years of service. When the prosecutor asked him to describe what had happened during the traffic stop several weeks earlier, he answered without hesitation. According to his testimony, he had stopped Ms. Carter for reckless driving. He claimed she became hostile almost immediately, ignored lawful instructions, resisted simple requests, and attempted to interfere with his investigation. Every sentence sounded polished, rehearsed, almost effortless. Jurors nodded quietly while several spectators exchanged knowing glances. After all, juries often trusted experienced officers. The judge listened carefully, occasionally making handwritten notes without revealing a single emotion. Denise never interrupted. She never rolled her eyes or shook her head. She simply listened. Her attorney, Michael Bennett, occasionally scribbled observations onto a legal pad before calmly sliding another document into his briefcase. He seemed strangely unconcerned despite the damaging testimony unfolding before everyone in the room. Hawkins continued confidently. He insisted every action he had taken was justified and consistent with departmental policy. He described himself as patient, professional, and restrained. By the time he finished, the courtroom felt as though the outcome had already been decided. Even some reporters had begun drafting headlines. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, yet it felt much longer. Judge Eleanor Whitmore slowly looked over the rim of her glasses before asking a simple question. Officer Hawkins, is your testimony today complete and truthful to the best of your knowledge? Hawkins met her eyes without blinking. Yes, Your Honor. His answer echoed across the room with unmistakable certainty. Then Michael Bennett rose from his chair. He adjusted his jacket, walked deliberately toward the center of the courtroom, and spoke in a voice so calm that nearly everyone leaned forward to hear him. Your Honor, he said, before I begin my cross-examination, the defense would like the court to review a piece of evidence that has not yet been presented. Hawkins' expression barely changed, but for the first time, his fingers tightened around the edge of the witness stand. Bennett placed a small flash drive on the evidence table without another word. Denise finally lifted her eyes toward the witness stand. There was no anger in her face, no satisfaction. Had entered the courtroom believing his story would never be questioned, suddenly looked at the flash drive as though it carried the weight of his entire career. The courtroom remained perfectly still after Michael Bennett placed the flash drive on the evidence table. The silence felt almost unnatural, as though every person inside the room instinctively understood that whatever happened next would determine far more than the outcome of a single lawsuit. Judge Eleanor Whitmore folded her hands together and looked first at the defense attorney, then toward Officer Daniel Hawkins. Counselor, she said calmly, before we proceed with your evidence, you may begin your cross-examination. Bennett nodded once. He approached the witness stand without raising his voice or displaying the slightest hint of aggression. Officer Hawkins, he began, you testified under oath that Ms. Denise Carter repeatedly refused to follow your lawful commands during the traffic stop. Is that correct? Hawkins answered immediately. Yes. You also testified that she became confrontational before you requested her identification? Correct. Bennett paused for several seconds, allowing the answer to settle over the courtroom before asking another question. And you maintain that every statement you made this morning is completely accurate? Hawkins looked directly at the judge before answering. Absolutely. Several jurors quietly nodded, still finding the officer's confidence persuasive. Denise remained motionless beside her attorney. She neither celebrated nor protested. Instead, she watched the witness with the same calm expression she had worn since entering the courtroom. Bennett slowly opened a folder containing dispatch records. Officer Hawkins, according to the dispatch log, your body camera remained active throughout the encounter. Hawkins hesitated for the first time. The pause lasted less than a second, yet it was long enough for Judge Whitmore to notice. The camera experienced technical issues, Hawkins replied. Not every recording is preserved. Bennett lifted another document. Interesting, because your written report never mentions any technical malfunction. Hawkins shifted slightly in his chair. It wasn't significant enough to include. The prosecutor rose quickly. Objection, argumentative. Overruled, Judge Whitmore answered. The witness may continue. Bennett walked a few steps before turning back toward the stand. Officer Hawkins, after the traffic stop, did you personally review your body camera footage? Hawkins swallowed before responding. No. Did anyone instruct you that the recording had been lost? That's my understanding. Bennett nodded thoughtfully. So today you're asking this court to rely entirely upon your memory. Yes. The attorney returned to the evidence table and gently rested one hand beside the small flash drive. Your Honor, the defense recently received a certified digital copy obtained through the department's evidence archive after a forensic audit. According to the chain of custody documentation, the recording was never destroyed. A murmur spread across the gallery before the bailiff called for order. Hawkins' confident posture began to fade. His shoulders stiffened. A faint line of perspiration appeared near his temple despite the cool air inside the courtroom. Bennett continued in the same measured tone. Officer Hawkins, before this court reviews the recording, I will ask you one final time. Is there anything in that video that contradicts your testimony today? Hawkins stared at the flash drive as though trying to remember something he desperately wished had never happened. His answer came much slower than before. No. Bennett looked toward the bench. Your Honor, the defense respectfully requests permission to publish Defendant's Exhibit 12. Judge Whitmore glanced across the silent courtroom before reaching for the remote connected to the large courtroom display. Permission granted. Every eye turned toward the dark monitor mounted beside the witness stand. Hawkins lowered his gaze for the first time since taking the oath. The screen flickered to life, and the first frozen frame of the body camera recording appeared, waiting for someone to press play. No one breathed as Judge Eleanor Whitmore pressed the play button. The large courtroom monitor flickered for a brief second before the body camera footage filled the screen. A timestamp appeared in the corner, matching the exact date and time of the traffic stop that Officer Daniel Hawkins had described only moments earlier. At first, everything looked ordinary. The patrol vehicle pulled behind Denise Carter's sedan as both cars came to a stop along a quiet suburban street. Hawkins stepped out confidently and approached the driver's window. The courtroom watched in complete silence. Then the first contradiction appeared. Good afternoon, officer, Denise said politely through the partially lowered window. Her voice was calm, respectful, and steady. It was nothing like the hostile behavior Hawkins had described under oath. Several jurors exchanged quick glances. Bennett remained silent, allowing the recording to speak for itself. On the screen, Hawkins immediately demanded her driver's license and registration. Denise responded without argument. She reached slowly toward her purse exactly as instructed. Every movement was deliberate, careful, and visible. There was no sign of resistance. No raised voice. No threatening gesture. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Hawkins stared at the monitor without blinking. As the recording continued, another unexpected detail emerged. Hawkins accused Denise of refusing to cooperate before she had even finished retrieving her identification. The accusation came first. Her response came afterward. Judge Whitmore quietly wrote another note. The atmosphere inside the courtroom changed almost instantly. Confidence was giving way to doubt. Then came the moment that caught everyone's attention. Denise calmly asked. "Officer, may I know why I was stopped?" Instead of answering directly, Hawkins repeated his command in a noticeably sharper tone. Again, Denise complied without argument. She handed over every requested document. Bennett slowly walked toward the jury box. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said softly, "please pay close attention to the timeline." The video continued. Dispatch audio could be heard clearly through the courtroom speakers. Every transmission matched the official records already admitted into evidence. Yet one statement from Hawkins' written report was nowhere to be found. He had testified that Denise ignored multiple lawful commands. The recording showed only one instruction before she fully complied. Murmurs spread through the gallery until the bailiff called for silence once again. Hawkins' confident posture had completely disappeared. His jaw tightened. His hands were clasped so firmly together that his knuckles had turned pale. For the first time that morning, he avoided looking toward the jury. Judge Whitmore paused the video. The frozen image displayed Denise sitting calmly behind the steering wheel with both hands visible. The judge looked directly at Officer Hawkins. "Officer," she said evenly, "this recording appears materially different from the testimony you provided under oath." Hawkins opened his mouth, but no words came. The confidence that had filled his voice only minutes earlier had vanished. Bennett returned to counsel table and rested his hand gently on the remaining exhibits. "Your Honor," he said, "the recording is not over. What the court has seen so far raises serious questions. What comes next answers every one of them." Judge Whitmore nodded once before reaching again for the playback controls. Across the courtroom, every eye returned to the screen, waiting to see what happened during the next 60 seconds that would determine whether Officer Hawkins had merely made a mistake or deliberately lied under oath. Judge Eleanor Whitmore pressed the play button once again. The frozen image dissolved into motion, and the courtroom became silent enough to hear the faint static of the patrol car's radio. Every face remained fixed on the screen. Officer Daniel Hawkins no longer looked at the monitor. Instead, he stared at the polished wood of the witness stand, as though avoiding the evidence might somehow change what it revealed. The recording continued exactly where it had stopped. Denise Carter sat calmly inside her vehicle with both hands visible on the steering wheel. Her voice never rose. Her movements remained slow and deliberate. Then Hawkins suddenly stepped closer to the driver's window and spoke with a tone completely different from the one he had demonstrated in court. "Step out of the vehicle. Now." Denise nodded immediately. "Yes, officer." She carefully unfastened her seatbelt, opened the door, and exited exactly as instructed. There was no hesitation, no argument, no resistance. Bennett allowed several more seconds of footage to play before speaking. "Your Honor, please note the timestamp." Judge Whitmore glanced at the digital clock displayed in the corner of the video before nodding silently. The next sequence unfolded even more slowly. Hawkins ordered Denise to place her hands behind her back while another officer arrived as backup. The second officer appeared visibly uncertain, repeatedly looking between Hawkins and Denise as though he sensed something was wrong but chose not to interfere. Then the audio captured every word with remarkable clarity. Hawkins claimed Denise had refused multiple commands and behaved aggressively. Yet the video showed the exact opposite. Denise quietly complied with every instruction before the accusation was ever made. Several members of the jury instinctively looked from the screen toward Hawkins, comparing the recording with the testimony they had heard less than 30 minutes earlier. Their expressions began to change. Bennett remained composed. He never interrupted the recording. He understood that no lawyer could argue more persuasively than the evidence itself. The courtroom speakers continued to replay the conversation exactly as it happened. Dispatch records confirmed each transmission. The timestamps matched every official document already admitted into evidence. Nothing had been edited. Nothing appeared manipulated. Every second reinforced the same conclusion. Hawkins had not simply remembered events differently. His sworn testimony conflicted with an objective recording created by his own department's equipment. The prosecutor slowly lowered his pen onto the table. He no longer appeared eager to defend the officer's version of events. Even the deputies standing along the courtroom walls exchanged brief, uneasy glances. They recognized the importance of what they were witnessing. Judge Whitmore paused the recording once more. She removed her glasses. and carefully folded them onto the bench before looking directly at Officer Hawkins. "Officer," she said in a measured voice, "this court has now observed multiple inconsistencies between your testimony and the body camera recording. You remain under oath. Would you like to amend any portion of your earlier statements before this evidence continues?" Hawkins took a slow breath. His lips parted slightly, but no explanation came. The confidence that had filled his testimony that morning had completely disappeared. Bennett quietly reached for the remote control resting beside the courtroom monitor. "Your Honor," he said calmly, "the next segment contains the conversation that determines whether these inconsistencies were accidental or intentional." Without another word, every person in the courtroom turned back toward the screen, waiting for the next minute of footage that would decide not only the outcome of the case, but the future of Officer Hawkins' career. The courtroom screen brightened again, and this time the recording captured something no one could dismiss as confusion. Officer Daniel Hawkins stood beside Denise Carter's car while the backup officer waited several feet away. Denise remained still, her hands visible, her voice controlled. Then Hawkins leaned closer to the open door and lowered his voice. "You should have done what I told you the first time." Denise looked at him carefully. "I did, officer." The words were quiet, almost gentle. Hawkins glanced toward the second officer before responding. "That is not what my report is going to say." A sharp breath moved through the courtroom. Someone in the gallery whispered, "Oh my God," before the bailiff immediately called for silence. On the witness stand, Hawkins closed his eyes for less than a second. It was not long enough to hide his reaction. Judge Eleanor Whitmore paused the video. Her expression remained controlled, but the stillness in her face carried more force than anger. "Officer Hawkins," she said, "did you just tell Ms. Carter that your written report would contradict what actually occurred?" Hawkins shifted in his seat. "Your Honor, that statement is being taken out of context." Defense. Attorney Michael Bennett stepped forward. "Then perhaps the remaining context will assist the court." Judge Whitmore nodded. The video resumed. The backup officer could now be heard asking Hawkins why Denise was being detained. Hawkins answered without hesitation. "She resisted." Denise immediately replied, "I never resisted." The second officer looked toward the body camera mounted on Hawkins' chest. "The footage will show it." Hawkins turned sharply toward him. "The camera has been unreliable all week." Every attorney in the room understood what those words meant. Hawkins had been thinking about the recording before the encounter ended. He knew the camera existed. He knew what it had captured. And he was already preparing an explanation for why the evidence should not be trusted. Bennett allowed the recording to continue. Hawkins returned to his patrol vehicle and began dictating preliminary notes into a department-issued recorder. His own voice filled the courtroom speakers. Driver became verbally combative and repeatedly refused lawful commands. On the screen, Denise stood quietly beside her car, saying nothing. The contradiction was no longer subtle. It was deliberate. The prosecutor slowly rose from his seat. "Your Honor, the state requests a brief recess to review the implications of this evidence." Judge Whitmore did not look away from Hawkins. Request denied for the moment. She leaned forward. "The court has now heard the witness describe events one way under oath, while the recording shows him documenting a different account before leaving the scene." Hawkins finally looked toward the prosecutor, but the man who had supported his testimony earlier avoided his eyes. Across the room, Denise remained composed. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. The truth unfolding before everyone was painful enough without triumph. Judge Whitmore turned to Bennett. "Is there additional footage?" Bennett glanced toward Denise, then back at the bench. "Yes, Your Honor. There is one final segment." He placed another digital file on the courtroom display. It was recorded after Officer Hawkins believed his body camera had been turned off. Hawkins' face lost what little color remained. The judge looked toward the darkened screen. "Play it." And in that instant, Hawkins understood that the most damaging evidence had not yet been seen. The courtroom monitor faded to black for only a moment before the final recording appeared. A small timestamp in the corner showed it had begun less than 2 minutes after the traffic stop officially ended. Officer Daniel Hawkins had returned to his patrol vehicle. Believing the encounter was over, he reached toward his chest as if turning off his body camera. But the recording continued. The audio became even clearer inside the silent courtroom. Hawkins exhaled heavily before speaking to the backup officer through the open driver's window. I think the camera's finally off. The other officer hesitated. You sure? Hawkins nodded without looking at the device. Yeah, doesn't matter now. Then came the words that froze the courtroom. I'll clean up the report before I submit it. Nobody's going to question an officer over a traffic stop. No one moved. Even the court reporter stopped typing for a brief second before quickly catching up. Judge Eleanor Whitmore remained perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the screen. Michael Bennett did not interrupt. He understood that silence had become more powerful than argument. The recording continued. The backup officer frowned. She wasn't fighting you. Hawkins shrugged. Doesn't have to. Once it's in the report, that's the version they'll remember. The second officer looked visibly uncomfortable. That's not how we're supposed to do this. Dispute the authenticity of this recording. Hawkins swallowed hard. No, Your Honor. Do you dispute that the voice on this recording is yours? His answer came almost as a whisper. No. Bennett remained standing beside the evidence table. Your Honor, the defense submits that the witness knowingly provided testimony inconsistent with objective evidence and with his own recorded statements. The prosecutor slowly rose. His shoulders seemed noticeably heavier than before. The state withdraws its reliance on Officer Hawkins' testimony, pending further review. It was a sentence no one in the courtroom expected to hear. Hawkins looked toward the prosecution table, searching for support, but none came. He was sitting alone now. Denise Carter remained exactly where she had been all morning. She neither smiled nor celebrated. She simply lowered her eyes for a moment, taking a slow breath that carried weeks of anxiety quietly out of her shoulders. For the first time since the hearing began, she looked relieved. Judge Whitmore closed the evidence folder in front of her. This court will address the legal consequences of what has been presented, she said calmly. But before any ruling is announced, there remains one final matter that cannot be ignored. She looked directly at the clerk. Notify Internal Affairs and the Office of Professional Responsibility that this court will be referring certified copies of today's proceedings immediately. The clerk nodded. Across the courtroom, the realization settled over everyone at once. The case was no longer about a disputed traffic stop. It had become an inquiry into whether a sworn officer had deliberately attempted to deceive the court itself. And everyone understood that the judge's next decision would reach far beyond this single courtroom. The silence inside courtroom 7 lingered for several long seconds after Judge Eleanor Whitmore ordered certified copies of the proceedings to be forwarded to Internal Affairs and the Office of Professional Responsibility. No one spoke. No one shifted in their seat. The atmosphere had changed completely. Earlier that morning, Officer Daniel Hawkins had entered the courtroom, wearing the confidence that often accompanied a decorated uniform. Now the badge on his chest seemed heavier than ever before. Judge Whitmore carefully closed the case file in front of her before looking directly at Hawkins. Her voice remained calm, but every word carried unmistakable authority. Officer Hawkins, this court has now reviewed your sworn testimony, the official dispatch records, your written report, and the authenticated body camera recording. Those pieces of evidence cannot all be true simultaneously. Hawkins lowered his eyes. His attorney quietly whispered something beside him, but Hawkins offered no response. The judge continued. The integrity of this court depends upon truthful testimony. When an officer appears before this bench, that oath carries extraordinary weight. If the public cannot rely upon sworn testimony, the foundation of justice itself begins to erode. Every juror listened without moving. Even the reporters had stopped writing, waiting for the judge's next words. Across the courtroom, Denise Carter sat with both hands folded together. She had imagined this day many times during the weeks leading to trial, yet nothing about the moment felt triumphant. Relief had replaced fear, but sadness lingered beneath it. She understood that accountability was necessary, yet she also recognized the damage dishonesty had done to every honest officer who served with integrity. The prosecutor slowly stood. Your Honor, he began. After reviewing the evidence presented today, the state formally withdraws all allegations against Ms. Carter. Judge Whitmore nodded. The motion is granted. Denise closed her eyes briefly as a quiet breath escaped her. The burden she had carried since the traffic stop finally began to lift. Judge Whitmore then turned toward the clerk. The record shall reflect that Ms. Carter is fully exonerated based upon the objective evidence presented before this court. A faint murmur passed through the gallery before fading once again into silence. The judge's attention returned to Hawkins. As for Officer Hawkins, this court finds probable cause to refer this matter for investigation regarding false statements under oath and the preparation of official documents inconsistent with the available evidence. Any criminal or administrative determination shall be made by the appropriate authorities following due process. Hawkins slowly removed his hands from the witness stand. For the first time since entering the courtroom, the certainty that had defined his testimony was completely gone. He looked toward the courtroom doors where several representatives from Internal Affairs had quietly entered and taken seats near the back of the gallery. They had witnessed everything. They needed no additional explanation. Bennett gently placed one reassuring hand on Denise's shoulder. Neither of them smiled. The truth had prevailed, but everyone in the room understood that justice was never a celebration. It was a responsibility. As Judge Whitmore prepared to adjourn the hearing, she looked across the courtroom one final time. Today's decision is not about choosing sides, she said. It is about choosing facts over assumptions, evidence over authority, and truth over convenience. Her gavel struck the bench once. The sharp sound echoed through the courtroom, signaling the end of the hearing. Yet for Officer Daniel Hawkins, everyone understood that the proceedings that truly mattered were only just beginning. By late afternoon, the courthouse steps were lined with reporters waiting beneath the warm glow of television lights. News of the hearing had spread faster than anyone expected. Camera crews adjusted their equipment while journalists rehearsed opening lines for the evening broadcast. Yet inside the courthouse, the atmosphere remained remarkably quiet. Denise Carter stood near one of the tall windows overlooking the city. For the first time in weeks, she was not thinking about legal arguments or evidence. She simply watched ordinary people walking along the sidewalk below, unaware that a courtroom upstairs had quietly reaffirmed something many feared had been lost: the importance of objective truth. Michael Bennett approached her carrying a small folder. "The clerk just confirmed the dismissal order has been entered," he said softly. Denise accepted the paperwork with both hands. She smiled, politely, but it was a restrained smile, shaped more by relief than celebration. "Thank you," she replied. Bennett shook his head. "You thanked the truth by refusing to give up on it. I only helped present it." Before Denise could answer, the courtroom doors opened once more. Several Internal Affairs investigators walked past them carrying sealed evidence boxes containing certified copies of the recordings, transcripts, and exhibits. No one spoke to Officer Daniel Hawkins as he quietly left through a separate hallway accompanied by his attorney. The confident stride that had marked his arrival that morning had disappeared. Every step now seemed slower, burdened not only by the investigation ahead, but also by the realization that a single dishonest decision had unraveled years of professional service. Downstairs, reporters immediately rushed toward Denise as she exited the courthouse. Questions echoed from every direction. "Miss Carter, do you feel vindicated? Do you plan to file additional claims? What would you like to say to the public?" Denise paused before the microphones. She looked briefly at the cameras, then toward the courthouse doors behind her. "Today was never about defeating one officer," she said calmly. "It was about making sure facts mattered more than assumptions. Honest officers deserve that just as much as ordinary citizens do." Her answer surprised many reporters expecting anger or revenge. Instead, her words carried quiet dignity. Across the plaza, several uniformed officers who had attended the hearing watched silently. One veteran sergeant slowly removed his cap and nodded respectfully toward Denise before walking away. It was a small gesture, but those who noticed understood its meaning. Respect had replaced suspicion. Later that evening, Judge Eleanor Whitmore remained alone in her chambers reviewing the final paperwork before signing the official referral orders. She paused for a moment, looking through the courtroom window now darkened by sunset. Cases involving false testimony always carried consequences beyond the individuals involved. Witness who would stand before the court. She signed the final page with steady handwriting before placing the documents into an outgoing file marked for immediate delivery. Outside, the courthouse lights illuminated the stone columns that had stood for generations. They had witnessed thousands of hearings, countless arguments, and endless disagreements. But days like this reminded everyone why those walls existed. Justice was never guaranteed by uniforms, titles, or authority alone. It depended upon evidence, accountability, and the courage to let the truth speak even when it exposed uncomfortable realities. As Denise quietly walked toward her car beneath the fading evening sky, she realized something important. The video had not saved her reputation by itself. It had simply given the truth the opportunity to be heard. And sometimes, that was all justice ever needed. Several months later, the courtroom had returned to its familiar rhythm. New cases filled the docket. Different attorneys stood before the bench. Different witnesses took the oath. Yet the hearing involving Denise Carter and Officer Daniel Hawkins continued to echo quietly through the courthouse. It was no longer discussed because of sensational headlines. It was remembered because it reminded everyone that justice could still correct itself when evidence was allowed to speak without fear. Denise had returned to her ordinary life. Friends often asked whether she felt victorious after the court dismissed every allegation against her. She always answered the same way. "I don't feel like I won. I feel grateful that the truth wasn't lost." Those words reflected the lesson she had carried from the beginning. Vindication was never about humiliating another person. It was about restoring what dishonesty had tried to take away: dignity, credibility, and peace of mind. Across the city, the police department quietly introduced additional procedures regarding body camera evidence, report verification, and courtroom testimony. Training officers began using anonymized portions of the case as an ethics discussion for new recruits. The purpose was not to embarrass one former officer. It was to remind every future officer that authority and accountability could never be separated. The badge represented public trust long before it represented power. Judge Eleanor Whitmore occasionally thought about the hearing whenever another witness raised a hand to swear the oath. She understood that justice depended upon more than statutes and procedures. It depended upon ordinary people choosing honesty even when dishonesty appeared easier. Courtrooms could evaluate evidence. They could apply the law, but they could never replace individual integrity. That responsibility belonged to every person who entered the courtroom, regardless of title or profession. Michael Bennett kept a copy of the dismissal order inside one of his trial notebooks. Not because it represented a legal victory, but because it reminded him why careful preparation mattered. Facts often arrived quietly. They rarely demanded attention. Yet when preserved with patience and presented faithfully, they possessed a strength that no false narrative could permanently overcome. As for Officer Daniel Hawkins, his career became a cautionary example discussed far beyond the courthouse where everything unraveled. People rarely remembered every detail of the traffic stop. They remembered something much simpler. A single decision to place convenience above truth had destroyed years of earned credibility. Reputation, once broken by dishonesty, could not be restored by explanations alone. On a quiet autumn afternoon, Denise walked past the courthouse once more. She paused briefly on the same steps where reporters had surrounded her months earlier. This time there were no cameras, no microphones, no crowd waiting for a statement. Only ordinary citizens entering the building in search of justice for problems, both large and small. She smiled gently before continuing on her way. The courthouse remained behind her, standing exactly where it always had, reminding everyone who passed that justice was never guaranteed by appearances, assumptions, or authority. It survived because truth could still be discovered, courage could still endure, and evidence could still overcome prejudice. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all. A lie may speak first, wear a uniform, and even stand under oath. But when truth finally enters the courtroom, it never needs to raise its voice. It only needs the chance to be seen.